So the first scenario I call Science and Technology Parks 3.0. This is a term that seems to be in use in the community, and I think it embodies a vision of future research parks or science parks where they're still recognizable to us, but they've just upgraded to the next version. And this is really a scenario of kind of incremental change. Looking at these four uncertainty factors, universities in this scenario are changing very quickly. And maybe that's one reason why parks haven't changed so much. Universities are becoming entrepreneurial. They're encouraging students to go out and experiment with business. And they're experimenting with technology transfer and IP frameworks to try and speed the flow of innovation into the marketplace. There's been a manageable but rather expensive transition to a cleaner energy platform. And sustainability is actually one area where parks are doing some calculated risk-taking. Some of them are becoming living labs for green technologies and sustainable design. And some parks might even be going carbon negative. They may actually be offsetting more carbon than they're consuming. And that's something that they can sell on the market to underlie a new business model, or something that they could offer to their tenants as a value-added service. Bioindustry, something that's starting to happen right now is that the recession is pushing venture capitalists out of biotech early stage funding. And so the big companies' strategic funds are coming in to pick that up. And so they're pulling these biotech startups in much, much more closely than any time before. And even as Andrew Whitty said, bringing them into the same campus and building in order to maximize collaboration. And so good parks in this scenario are ones that create a physical framework for that to happen easily. Successful parks are also ones that are able to support the kind of translational research, the ability for researchers and ideas to move from lab bench to bedside very quickly to create biomedical innovation. That means being near teaching hospitals, being near large population centers. Alex, can you get me back on track to the next slide? No, the next, okay, I got it. And new science networks, these new institutions of science that are forming online. In this scenario, science parks are a spur on this superhighway of online innovation. They're participating in networks, they're hosting bloggers conferences and things like that, but they're not necessarily the main hubs. We can see some signs of what this might look like, this scenario already. What Mike Juroff at MIT calls new century cities, places that combine innovation with other uses like housing and retail and entertainment. And science parks that are coupled with very entrepreneurial universities, like Skysong Innovation Center at Arizona State in the United States. It might also look like upgrading an existing park by literally plugging in a module of the next generation kind of space. And this is what's happened in Joensuu Science Park in Finland, where they took a single floor in a large park and turned it into a collaborative, easy to access space for freelancers and interesting people and small companies. And Ilkka Kakko, who was the designer, is here today, and you should talk to him about that experience. It might be like installing a new operating system for a region. What they're starting to try to do here in North Carolina with the North Carolina Research Parks Network, and think about how a set of parks, instead of competing, can leverage a network to become something on a global scale that's bigger than the sum of its parts. The second scenario I call the rise of research clouds. And next slide. And in this scenario, research parks are challenged by a cloud of small, independent spaces for R&D that have popped up around universities, around existing parks, around big companies that are all tied together by social software. Can you get my cursor back on the no, the other one. Yeah. Go back one, please. Sorry, we're pushing the envelope with this presentation tool here. And this is really a scenario of disruptive transformation of the research park model from outside the industry. Universities are seeing many small independent spaces being built around them by various players. Maybe people setting up incubators to capture spin-out activity. Maybe freelancers joining together to set up little working spaces of their own. Maybe companies creating outposts, listening posts, so that they can connect to an innovative region. But universities aren't really The elite universities don't see this as a serious threat, and they haven't really engaged it. It's the small and up-and-coming universities that can't afford to build big research campuses or research parks that start taking the opportunity to say, hey, maybe we can connect to a much larger number of little research spaces around us and turn that into almost a virtual park. And there's a certain scenario where we could see some parks that are affiliated with universities actually turning away from the university to engage this research cloud because it's actually a better source of innovation than the universities. Clouds put legacy parks at a disadvantage because they're very amorphous, they're hard to pin down, they're hard to define, and hard to put a carbon footprint on. And they also utilize space much more efficiently because the space is all shared, and there's only enough space for the people that are there when they're there. In bioindustry, a lot of experts right now think that biotech needs more vertical integration and fewer networks to produce breakthroughs. But in this cloud scenario, highly distributed R&D is actually working. It's not solving every problem, but it is making some breakthroughs. And that's largely because they're operating under a totally different framework about how you share and protect and get value out of intellectual property. Science networks are born in these kinds of spaces. They're not just coming to land here, but because these clouds really have no institutional structure, they have to create new institutions to help govern them and solve problems. And so they become sort of this environment that universities used to be, free, open places for the exchange of ideas between people of different walks of life. And that becomes a very attractive thing for both companies and universities. What might this scenario look like? It might look like the kinds of things we see happening in the region around MIT and Boston. Many, many different players creating spaces for R&D to serve many different kinds of customers, spin-off companies, government research labs, foundation-sponsored research. It might look like networks of independent cooperatives getting together and saying, hey, we're a research park, or we're a place where companies can put workers and get a lot of value out of. This is happening in Milan, where a series of 5 co-working spaces that are targeted for designers. You can rent an office or a desk by the day. These 5 spaces have come together in a network and are marketing themselves jointly. Same thing's starting to happen with a group called Adams Morgan Works in Washington, D.C. Or it might look like social networks on the web that provide the glue that helps pull these isolated pods of workers or pods of researchers together into collaborative, quote, organizations. Things like the Freelancers Union, which is a union for people who don't work for companies. Or even the Science in the Triangle website, which is blogging this conference, and is now becoming a voice and a gathering point online for people that do science scattered across the entire North Carolina area. The third scenario is what I call dematerialized innovation. And this is the scary scenario. This is where research parks are in deep trouble because their whole economic model has been undermined by very expensive research and development. And in this scenario, research doesn't just scatter to a network of small spaces, but it almost becomes completely virtualized, reducing demand for space.